So we just found another bacterial species that is going by the name Chonkus. That's right, Chonkus. We're going to talk all about Chonkus and so many more other things on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. So one of the fun things about getting older and being a millennial is that eventually you get to the point where millennials are starting to take over multiple different industries. Like, for example, sometimes I will see a commercial or an advertisement and I'll be like, yes, that was definitely made by a millennial. You also start to see the same type of thing in the case of science. Like, one of the cool instances is with the revelation of this new type of bacteria called Chonkus. We're going to talk about Chonkus in just a couple seconds, but first, hello there. Welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and the infamous, and that would be, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria and all such related microorganisms. Before we jump into our story about Chonkus, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this on YouTube, or if you're listening to this somewhere else, maybe on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel and help support the podcast. Now, let's talk a little bit about this little guy, Chonkus. Now, right out of the gate, I feel like I should tell you, as much as I would love to tell you that the actual name of this bacteria is Chonkus, that's not actually the bacteria's name. That is affectionately what the folks that did this paper named. The actual name of this bacteria is Utex 3222. That's Utex 3222. But for whatever reason, and for reasons that we'll explore in a second, the researchers decided to name him affectionately Chonkus. Now, Utex 3222 is actually part of a group of different types of Utexes. They mentioned in the paper, Utex 3221. They mentioned, let me see. I think there was like a Utex 2973. Let me see. Yeah, then there's a Utex. Yeah, Utex 3221, Utex 30. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different Utexes. And the one thing that all the Utexes have in common, and indeed what Chonkus is these are different kinds of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are extremely cool bacteria. They are the most abundant bacteria that you will find in these United States. Indeed, in the world. And the thing that sets cyanobacteria apart from a bunch of other different kinds of bacteria is the fact that they are photosynthetic. They are autotrophs. What they can do is they can use the power of the sun, and they can use CO2, and they do a little bit of magic, and with those two things, they're able to synthesize complex biomolecules that they can use as a basis for metabolism. They also produce oxygen, which we'll talk about in a second, but they don't need to consume external biomolecules like you or I have to because they have this ability to do photosynthesis. Now, within the context of world history, cyanobacteria are actually extremely important. I mentioned a second ago that they have the ability to mass produce oxygen because of this photosynthesis that they do, and it's thought that they were the basis of what's called the Great Oxygenation Event. The Great Oxygenation Event, also known as the GOE, this happened about, let me see, we have the technology, hang on, when did this happen? The Great Oxygenation Event, that occurred approximately 2.4 billion years ago. That's billion with a B. And what happened is during the Great Oxygenation Event, there was this huge spike in atmospheric oxygen. Now that did a couple of different things. The first thing that it did is, wow, now everything that relies on oxygen in order to do metabolism, now they're able to grow more rapidly. Number two, it was the basis, or it's theorized that was the basis for the ozone layer. And what the ozone layer does, of course, is that's protecting us from all the different UV radiation and all the different types of radiation that are coming in from outer space, right? And so this ozone layer, as soon as that ozone layer comes into play, then essentially the Earth is shielded. And so that allowed for other types of organisms to grow and evolve and eventually end up on Earth, right? So the Great Oxygenation Event is extremely important for the context of our own evolution and for the evolution of life on Earth, period. So cyanobacteria, extremely important. It's theorized, I guess, that folks could use cyanobacteria as a way of doing terraforming. People have talked about using cyanobacteria to terraform something like Mars in a similar way that it, in theory, terraformed or helped with the terraformation of, or I guess the terraformation of Earth. But the main point being here is that cyanobacteria are a bunch of really, really cool bacteria, and they do a whole bunch of really cool stuff. Not the least of which is their ability to photosynthesize and produce oxygen. So that's the background on cyanobacteria. Let's talk a little bit more about Chonkus. First of all, how on earth would you go about finding a bacteria by the name of Chonkus? Now, what they were doing, and they were up at, let me see where they're from. All right, Mr. Sir or Mrs. Man, where are you from? Okay, so the Weiss Institute of Biologically Inspired Engineering in Boston, Massachusetts. Where's this person? The Department of Physiology and Biophysics, Weill Cornell Medical College in New York, USA. Anyway, so yeah, okay, so it turns out there's a whole bunch of different people on this paper. I think north of 20 authors. That's wild. So a whole bunch of different people were at work on this paper. And what they were doing is they were trying to find new types of cyanobacteria. Now, how do you go about trying to find new types of cyanobacteria? Well, as I mentioned a second ago, cyanobacteria, they're photosynthetic and they use CO2. So what they had to do is they had to find environments that a lot of people wouldn't go to that is enriched in CO2. And the place that they settled on was a place called Bahia de Levante, and that's near a place called Volcano Island, which I'm going to guess, although I don't know for 100% certainty, that there's a volcano involved. Oh, look, a volcanic region, yes. Now, what they ended up having to do is they had to look in the aquatic environment around these volcano islands. So they were like, we'll have to go scuba diving off the coast of this volcano island, which now that I read it out loud, that sounds like an incredible grant to be a part of. I would love to be part of this grant and learn how to scuba dive and look around Volcano Island and find bacteria. That sounds like the most fun thing in the whole wide world. But anyway, so the neat thing about this environment is that there's a lot of CO2. It's CO2 enriched. And so that's a perfect place for you to start looking for cyanobacteria, because cyanobacteria obviously are going to be relying on the presence of CO2 in order for them to mass produce their biomolecules. Okay, so it was in this environment, using their epic scuba gear, that the researchers were able to find this new bacteria, Utex 3222. And the reason why they the reason why they focused in particular on something like Utex 3222 as opposed to any of the other Uteces, is the Utex 3222 Chonkus had this really neat phenotype. And what was this phenotype? Well, normally what will happen is if you take a little bacteria and then you put it into a glass tube and you swirl it around a little bit, eventually what's going to happen is it'll take a while. Eventually all the cells will kind of like sediment and settle towards the bottom of the tube. And that's fine. That's just like a normal thing. But instead of taking a long time to settle, Utex 3222, what it did is it settled extremely rapidly. Right? And it made this really concentrated schmear down at the bottom of the tube. And they compared it to something like green peanut butter. It just stuck down to the bottom of the tube. And they did it extremely rapidly. Now, we'll talk about why this is exciting and relevant in a second. But the first question is why? Why is it that this thing is happening? Now, what the researchers figured out, and they're still trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of this, but it seems like there's two different life phases for something like Chonkus. Chonkus will, if you were to just inoculate a given environment with Chonkus, it'll start off in this smaller, as the cell will be a smaller volume, right? And then they'll start doing photosynthesis, and then they'll divide, and there'll be more and more of these little Chonkus bacteria. And then what will happen is they'll go through this maturation event. This could be due to starvation. It could be could be a temporal thing. It could be because they've built up a whole bunch of carbon within themselves. There's a whole bunch of different, again, they're trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of this. But what will happen is then the volume of the cells will increase, right? The cells will grow in volume. They'll just get overall bigger. It's because of this that it was affectionately named Chonkus, because it was just a really, really big cell. And as soon as that cell gets a lot bigger, then it's just going to drop to the bottom of the container that it's in. And this could be the test tube, like we mentioned, or it could be in the context of their environment. So they'll start up at the surface of the water, then they'll swell up to a really large volume, and then they'll drop down to the bottom. Okay, and that's why they were called Chonkus, because they became these really, really big cells. Now, this is just a really kind of cool, kind of cutesy thing that they do, but this is actually extremely important within the context of industry. In order to explain this, I need to explain something called bioreactors. Now, what is a bioreactor? So a bioreactor, it's a large environment, right? And essentially, it's just like a big culture container for bacteria, right? What we oftentimes use bacteria for in the context of industry is we'll genetically modify different bacteria and tell them to make specific types of either proteins or biomolecules, things like that. This is how actually insulin is made, right? And so what you can do in a bioreactor is, because it's so large, you inoculate that bioreactor with your bacteria of interest, right? You keep shaking them, you give them tons of food, and then they'll mass produce this biomolecule that you want, or the protein that you want, whatever it is that you want, that you can mass produce them in this huge bioreactor. And therefore, you have tons and tons and tons of your biomolecule that you can use in the context of industry, in the context of medicine, whatever you want. Now, the downside of something like this is you have to have a way of getting that bacteria that just built all of your biomolecules. You have to get them out of this bioreactor in order to get at the biomolecule that's inside them. Right? Does that make sense? So you have all these bacteria that are swimming around, but you have to have a way of getting those bacteria that contain your biomolecule of interest and get them out of this bioreactor, right? And actually, that's really hard to do. They mentioned in the paper here, about 30% of all of the time and resources go into extracting them out of this aqueous environment, getting them out of this watery environment. Okay? Now, let's think about this then in the context of Chonkus, because what Chonkus does, right? Remember that it's going to reach its maturation stage, and then it's going to drop down to the bottom of whatever container it's in. It's going to stick down there at the bottom. Now, this would actually be really useful then in the context of a bioreactor, because then what you could do is you could say, all right, Chonkus, go ahead and make this biomolecule that I want, right? And then it'll keep on making it. And then once they reach that maturation stage, they'll drop down to the bottom of the bioreactor, and lo and behold, there's your bacteria. And then you can scoop out that bacteria, and you don't have to worry anymore about trying to get it out of this culture, right? So that'd be extremely, extremely useful in the context of industry. Now, they haven't done anything like that yet, but that is where they're aiming with this new bacteria. The second big thing about Chonkus is that because it's a cyanobacteria, because it has the ability to break down and utilize CO2, is that this could actually be really relevant in the context of climate change, right? So as CO2 is going to continuously increase, first of all, it'd be really useful to have bacteria around that can process and bring down the environmental levels of CO2. So it's possible that we could use Chonkus in the future as a way of combating climate change. That would be absolutely wild. But it's also worth noting that these bacteria, as I mentioned, they have this phenotype where they just drop down to the bottom. So it's possible that Chonkus is actually involved in the normal carbon cycling of our planet, right? What they'll do is you'll have CO2 that's being produced into the atmosphere, right? And that carbon then gets grabbed hold of by Chonkus, and then it gets sequestered at the bottom of the ocean, or the bottom where the sediments are being formed. And that's how you get carbon from the environment down to the sediment, because of bacteria like Chonkus, which start up at the surface of the water and then make their way down. So it's theorized, again, we're still trying to figure out something like this, but it's theorized then that Chonkus could be involved in something like the normal carbon cycling of our own environments. So utterly cool story, but let's wrap this up and then we can get out of here. So first of all, number one, we were talking about cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, extremely cool bacteria. They're photosynthetic and were super important to the evolution of life on this planet. Number two, there's a group of researchers that, using scuba gear off the coast of a volcano island or something like this, they were able to identify a couple of new different types of cyanobacteria, one of which was called Chonkus. Number three, Chonkus, something that is unique about Chonkus is the fact that it seemed to have two different life stages. One where it started off small, and then as it got bigger and had a larger cell volume, it would drop down to the bottom of whatever type of container in which it was found, right? And number 3, this phenotype of starting small, getting big, and then dropping down to the bottom of the container would be extremely useful, or is thought to be extremely useful in the context of industry, where a lot of researchers have trouble extracting bacteria out of solution. It's a really, really cool story. Again, it's another amazing instance of bacterial diversity and how we can use bacterial diversity to help us not only in the context of medicine, but maybe in the context of climate change as well. Anyway, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much, every single one of you guys, for listening, and I hope I'll see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories Bacteria.